Inequality is usually explained as a moral problem. Some people are greedy. Some people are unlucky. Some governments are corrupt. Some systems are unfair. And while all of that sounds true, it misses something deeper. Inequality today is not an accident. It is not the result of a few bad policies. It is not the result of individual failure. It is the result of how the modern economic system is designed. Across the world, the same pattern is repeating. Wages are barely growing. Living costs are rising. Asset prices are exploding. Debt is expanding. Jobs are becoming less secure. And as this happens, wealth is flowing upward. Not slowly. Relentlessly. This documentary is not about blaming any single group. It is about explaining the structural forces that are quietly reshaping every economy. Because once inequality reaches a certain level, it stops being a social issue. It becomes an economic instability. It weakens growth. It fuels debt. It destabilizes politics. It increases financial crises. It erodes trust in institutions. In other words, inequality is no longer a side effect of capitalism. It is becoming one of its defining features. And the most dangerous part is that almost nobody notices it happening. Not because it is hidden, but because it unfolds gradually. Year after year. Policy after policy. Crisis after crisis. Each one pushing wealth a little higher up the ladder. Until one day people look around and realize that the middle has disappeared. How inequality became structural. To understand why inequality is rising everywhere, we have to go back to a simple question. What changed? For most of modern history, economic growth was shared more evenly. Not perfectly. Not fairly. But enough that living standards improved for most people at the same time. Wages rose alongside productivity. As companies became more efficient, workers earned more. As technology improved, jobs became better paid. As economies expanded, governments invested more in public services. This created a broad middle class. That system no longer exists. Over the past few decades, the relationship between productivity and wages broke. Companies became dramatically more productive. But wages stopped rising. Instead of sharing gains with workers, companies redirected profits upward. To executives. To shareholders. To financial markets. This shift did not happen by accident. It happened because of three structural changes. First, financialization. Modern economies became dominated by financial markets instead of real production. Companies stopped being valued for what they made. They started being valued for how their stock prices performed. This changed corporate behavior. Instead of investing profits in wages or innovation, companies invested in stock buybacks. This boosted share prices, which boosted executive compensation, which benefited wealthy investors. But it did nothing for workers. Second, technology. Automation replaced human labor. AI replaced cognitive labor. Digital platforms replaced middlemen. This increased efficiency. But it also destroyed bargaining power. When a worker is easily replaceable by a machine or software, wages stagnate, even if productivity rises. Third, globalization. Companies outsourced manufacturing to low-wage countries. This lowered costs. But it also weakened unions. It reduced job security. It put workers in direct competition with each other globally, which pushed wages down everywhere. These three forces created a perfect storm. Profits surged. Wages stagnated. Job security collapsed. And all the extra money flowed upward. Why wages stopped rising? For most of modern economic history, there was a simple rule. When productivity rose, wages rose. When companies became more efficient, workers earned more. When technology improved, living standards improved. This relationship was not perfect. It was not fair. But it existed. And for decades, it defined economic progress. That relationship is now broken. Productivity has continued to rise. Companies produce more with fewer workers. Technology has made businesses faster, cheaper, and more efficient. But wages have barely moved. In many countries, real wages have been flat for decades. This is not a coincidence. It is the result of structural changes that quietly shifted power away from workers. The first structural change is bargaining power collapse. Wages do not rise automatically. They rise when workers have leverage. Leverage comes from scarcity. If skilled workers are hard to replace, employers must pay more. If jobs are plentiful, workers can demand better conditions. If unions are strong, wages rise faster. All of those conditions weakened. Automation made many jobs replaceable. Globalization created a massive pool of low-cost labor. Digital platforms made work more fragmented and insecure. Unions declined. Job security vanished. This destroyed bargaining power. When workers lose leverage, wages stop rising. Even if productivity explodes. The second structural change is financialized corporate incentives. Modern corporations are no longer optimized for long-term stability. They are optimized for short-term stock performance. Executives are paid in stock. Investors demand quarterly growth. Boards reward cost-cutting. This creates a brutal incentive structure. If a company can increase profits by freezing wages, outsourcing labor, automating jobs, cutting benefits, it will. Because the market rewards those decisions. It does not reward paying workers more. It does not reward long-term investment in human capital. It rewards short-term financial engineering. This is why stock buybacks exploded. Instead of using profits to raise wages or improve working conditions, companies used profits to buy their own shares. This boosted stock prices, which boosted executive pay, which enriched shareholders. But it did nothing for workers. This created a one-way transfer of value from labor to capital. The third structural change is technological displacement. Automation did not just replace factory workers. It moved up the skill ladder. Clerical jobs, customer service, accounting, design, programming, writing. These were once secure middle-class careers. They are now vulnerable. When workers know their jobs can disappear at any moment, they stop demanding higher pay. They accept worse conditions. They work longer hours. They tolerate insecurity. Fear becomes a wage suppressor. This psychological effect is just as powerful as economic pressure. The fourth structural change is global labor arbitrage. Companies discovered they could hire workers anywhere in the world. This created a global labor market. Instead of competing for workers locally, companies now compare wages globally. If a worker in one country demands more pay, the company can move the job elsewhere. This keeps wages down everywhere. Not just in rich countries. Even in low-wage countries, workers compete against even lower-wage regions. This creates a race to the bottom. And because capital is mobile and labor is not, capital always wins. The fifth structural change is credential inflation. As good jobs became scarce, employers raised hiring requirements. Jobs that once required a high school education now require a university degree. Jobs that once required a degree now require multiple certifications. This increases competition, which pushes wages down. Because more people chase fewer good jobs. The sixth structural change is debt dependency. When wages stagnate, people borrow. They use credit cards. They take personal loans. They use buy now pay later systems. This keeps consumption going, which hides the wage problem. But it also traps workers. Debt makes people less willing to quit jobs, less willing to strike, less willing to negotiate. Because missing a paycheck becomes catastrophic. Debt becomes a tool of wage suppression. The seventh structural change is policy bias. Governments increasingly favor capital over labor. They cut corporate taxes. They weaken labor protections. They deregulate industries. They prioritize stock markets over job security. This is not ideological. It is structural. Because governments depend on financial markets for stability. They depend on corporations for tax revenue. They depend on investors for growth. Workers become politically weaker. And when political power shifts, economic outcomes follow. The eighth structural change is platformization. Digital platforms transformed employment into gig work. Instead of stable jobs, people get short-term contracts. Instead of benefits, people get flexibility. Instead of security, people get algorithms. This reduces labor costs for companies. But it destroys income stability for workers. And unstable workers cannot demand higher wages. The ninth structural change is productivity capture. Even when workers become more productive, they do not capture the gains. AI tools make employees more efficient. Software automates workflows. Data analytics optimize operations. But instead of sharing those gains, companies reduce headcount. They fire workers. They freeze salaries. They raise output targets. This creates a paradox. Workers work harder. Workers produce more. Workers earn the same. This breaks the social contract. The 10th structural change is social normalization. Over time, people adapt to stagnation. They lower expectations. They accept instability. They internalize failure. They blame themselves. This psychological shift matters because it reduces resistance. When people stop expecting better, systems stop delivering better. All of these forces interact. They reinforce each other. Automation weakens bargaining power. Weakened bargaining power suppresses wages. Suppressed wages increase debt. Debt increases job dependency. Dependency reduces resistance. Reduced resistance encourages exploitation. This creates a self-sustaining inequality machine. And once this machine is built, it does not need malicious actors. It runs automatically. Because every institution inside it is rewarded for maintaining it. This is why wages stopped rising. Not because of one bad policy. Not because of one technology. But because the entire economic structure shifted against labor. How asset inflation is replacing income. There was a time when wealth came mainly from work. You got a job. You earned a salary. You saved money. You slowly built a better life. Assets existed. But they were not the main engine of economic survival. That has changed. Today, income from work is no longer enough to build financial security. Instead, wealth increasingly comes from owning assets. Stocks. Real estate. Financial instruments. This shift is one of the most important drivers of modern inequality. And most people do not even realize it is happening. The first structural change is monetary expansion. To prevent economic collapses, central authorities injected massive amounts of money into the financial system. They lowered interest rates. They bought financial assets. They flooded markets with liquidity. This stabilized economies. But it had a side effect. It inflated asset prices. Stocks rose. Housing prices rose. Financial instruments rose. This created a wealth boom. But only for people who already own assets. Workers who relied on wages did not benefit. Their incomes stayed flat. Their living costs rose. Their purchasing power fell. This created a split economy. One part of the population became richer without working more. The other part worked more without becoming richer. The second structural change is yield desperation. When interest rates fall, safe investments stop paying returns. Savings accounts pay nothing. Government bonds pay almost nothing. This forces investors to take more risks. They move money into stocks, real estate, speculative assets. This pushes prices higher. Not because the underlying assets became more valuable, but because there is nowhere else for money to go. This creates artificial inflation. Asset prices become disconnected from real economic value. The third structural change is leverage expansion. As asset prices rise, people borrow against them. They use rising home values to take out loans. They use stock portfolios as collateral. They use financial instruments to amplify gains. This injects even more money into asset markets, which pushes prices even higher, which justifies even more borrowing. This creates a self-reinforcing bubble. And like all bubbles, it benefits early participants the most. The fourth structural change is corporate financial engineering. Instead of investing profits into real production, companies invest in their own stock. They use profits to buy back shares. This reduces the number of shares in circulation, which pushes prices higher, which increases executive compensation, which rewards shareholders. But it does not increase wages. It does not create jobs. It does not improve productivity. It simply redistributes wealth upward. The fifth structural change is housing financialization. Housing stopped being shelter. It became an investment class. Large investors bought residential properties. They turned homes into rental assets. They pushed prices up. They reduced supply. This made home ownership unaffordable for ordinary people, which forced them to rent, which transferred income to asset owners, which widened inequality. The sixth structural change is inheritance amplification. As asset prices rise, wealth becomes inherited rather than earned. Children of asset owners receive property, stocks, financial portfolios. They start life ahead. Children of non-owners start with nothing. This creates a permanent wealth divide, which grows with each generation. The seventh structural change is retirement distortion. Pension systems increasingly depend on financial markets. People's retirement security now depends on stock prices. This makes governments prioritize market stability over wage growth. Because if markets fall, millions lose retirement savings. This creates political pressure to keep asset prices inflated, even if it harms workers. The eighth structural change is psychological illusion. Rising asset prices create the illusion of prosperity. Governments point to stock market growth as economic success. Media celebrates rising home values. But most people do not own significant assets, so they do not benefit. Yet the illusion persists, which delays reform. The ninth structural change is income replacement. As wages stagnate, people rely on asset gains to survive. They borrow against home equity. They speculate in financial markets. They invest in risky assets. This replaces stable income with volatile wealth, which increases financial fragility. The 10th structural change is consumption distortion. Wealthy asset owners spend differently. They invest more. They save more. They consume less proportionally. This weakens demand in the real economy, which slows wage growth, which reinforces inequality. This creates a dangerous feedback loop. Asset inflation increases inequality. Inequality reduces wage growth. Weak wage growth increases debt. Debt increases financial fragility. Fragility increases reliance on asset bubbles. The system becomes addicted to asset inflation. not because it is healthy, but because it is the only thing keeping growth alive. This is why inequality is accelerating. Not because people stopped working, but because work stopped being the main path to wealth. At a certain point, inequality stops being a side effect of the system. It becomes the system. That point has already been crossed. What makes modern inequality different from past inequality is not just its size. It is its structure. It now feeds on itself. Each round of inequality makes the next round more extreme. And the system increasingly locks people into permanent economic positions. The first self-reinforcing loop is political power. Wealth buys influence. As wealth concentrates, political influence concentrates with it. This shifts policy decisions. Tax systems become more favorable to capital. Regulations become lighter for large corporations. Labor protections weaken. Public services are underfunded. Each of these changes benefits the wealthy. And each one makes it harder for the poor and middle class to improve their position. This creates a vicious cycle. Wealth increases power. Power reshapes policy. Policy increases wealth. The second self-reinforcing loop is education inequality. As inequality rises, access to quality education becomes more unequal. Wealthy families can afford better schools, private tutors, safer neighborhoods, better technology, more time for learning. Poorer families cannot. This creates skill gaps, which translate into income gaps, which translate into wealth gaps, which translate into education gaps for the next generation. This is how inequality becomes hereditary. The third self-reinforcing loop is geographic segregation. As housing prices rise, cities become divided. Wealthy people cluster in high-opportunity areas. Poorer people are pushed into low-opportunity regions. This affects access to good jobs, quality schools, healthcare, transportation, which reduces social mobility. Once people are physically separated by income, it becomes harder to break out of poverty. Because opportunity itself becomes geographically locked. The fourth self-reinforcing loop is health inequality. Wealthier people live healthier lives. They have better food, better housing, better healthcare, lower stress, more time for rest. Poorer people experience chronic stress, worse nutrition, unsafe living conditions, limited healthcare access. This affects productivity. It affects learning. It affects life expectancy, which reduces economic mobility, which reinforces poverty. The fifth self-reinforcing loop is digital exclusion. As the economy becomes more digital, access to technology becomes more important. Wealthy people have faster internet, better devices, more digital skills, access to online networks. Poorer people have limited connectivity, outdated hardware, fewer digital skills, less online visibility. This creates a digital divide, which affects job opportunities, which affects income, which affects wealth. The sixth self-reinforcing loop is social capital. Wealthy people have stronger networks. They know people in powerful positions. They get insider information. They access better opportunities. Poorer people rely on weaker networks. They have fewer connections. They have less visibility. They face more barriers. This makes inequality invisible but persistent. Because success increasingly depends on who you know, not just what you know. The seventh self-reinforcing loop is cultural normalization. As inequality persists, it becomes normalized. People stop expecting social mobility. They accept precarity. They internalize blame. They lower aspirations. This psychological shift matters because it reduces resistance. When people stop believing the system can change, the system stops changing. The eighth self-reinforcing loop is financial fragility. Poorer households are more exposed to economic shocks. They have no savings, high debt, unstable income. When crises hit, they lose everything. Wealthy households absorb losses. They buy distressed assets. They increase their wealth. This transfers wealth upward during every crisis, which accelerates inequality. The ninth self-reinforcing loop is corporate concentration. As inequality rises, large corporations grow stronger. They acquire competitors. They dominate markets. They suppress wages. They influence regulations. This increases profits, which increases executive pay, which increases shareholder wealth, which increases inequality. The 10th self-reinforcing loop is time. Wealth compounds. Debt compounds. Advantage compounds. Disadvantage compounds. Over long periods, small differences become massive gaps. This is why inequality accelerates even if policies stay the same. Because compounding never stops. All of these loops interact. They reinforce each other. Political power shapes education. Education shapes income. Income shapes health. Health shapes productivity. Productivity shapes wealth. Wealth shapes political power. This creates a closed system. And once a system becomes closed, breaking into it becomes almost impossible. This is why inequality is no longer just rising. It is hardening, turning into a permanent economic caste system. Inequality is not rising because people stopped working. It is rising because the economic system stopped rewarding work. Wages stopped growing. Assets started exploding. Debt replaced income. Technology replaced labor. Finance replaced production. And as all of this happened, wealth began flowing upward. Not through conspiracy. Not through corruption alone. But through structure. Through incentives that reward capital over labor. Through policies that protect markets over workers. Through technologies that centralize power. Through systems that compound advantage. This is what makes modern inequality so dangerous. It is not temporary. It is not accidental. It is not self-correcting. It is self-reinforcing. Each crisis transfers more wealth upward. Each technological leap weakens bargaining power. Each financial rescue inflates assets. Each generation inherits a wider gap. And over time, inequality stops being a social problem. It becomes an economic instability. It weakens growth. It fuels debt. It destabilizes politics. It erodes trust in institutions. This does not mean collapse is inevitable. But it does mean the system is becoming more fragile. Because no economy can remain stable when most people feel locked out of progress. If you want to understand how money, power, and economic systems are quietly reshaping the world, subscribe to this channel. Each week, we break down the structures behind the headlines. Not with hype. Not with outrage. Not with politics. But with calm, long-form explanations. The next episode explores another hidden shift already changing the economy. Because the most important transformations rarely announce themselves. They simply happen.